You know what I do with my paper? I make scratch pads. Yeah.
All right, we're going to begin in 30 seconds. Please ensure your cell phones are off or on silent. Council members, ensure your microphones are turned on. Just want to remind anybody that will be addressing the council to come up to the podium, one of the microphones, when you're interacting with council. If it's anything more than just a simple response. All right. Good evening. Today is Monday, April 10th, 2023. This is a regular legislative meeting of the Barberton City Council. Before we begin our legislative meeting, we will be doing individual committee meetings, and it is 6:01 p.m. and we will start with City Properties, Parks, and Recreation with Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. President. City Properties and Park Recreation meeting at 6:01. Council Chambers, members present, including myself as chair, Mr. Heidick and Mrs. Fry, and other council members noted, and guests also noted. We have one request for legislation, a letter from Mayor Judge requesting appointment of Mr. Robert Martin to the Parks Commission to be for the unexpired term starting immediately, ending on December 31st, 2027. We're going to be asking a special Parks Committee meeting next week for this. Mr. Heidick reached out to the mayor today for the questionnaire. We still have not got that questionnaire back, and Mr. Greer still has not got that back yet. So we're going to do a special meeting next week for that. And we have no pending legislation, and we'll open this up for miscellaneous discussion. No? No? Yes.
Why are you doing a special meeting on an appointment?
We were supposed to be getting a questionnaire back.
A new questionnaire, is that what you're saying?
Yes,
or-
Mr. Judge, talk about that.
Yeah, so since this is a school appointment,
Okay,
he submitted a resume, it went through the school board, but not the application to council.
okay, all right,
So I'll get that out to him and have that back.
all right, I noticed that was different. Okay, so we're not doing anything today.
No, ma'am.
All right,
And we also had Mr. Patterson pass out some Barberton Parks and Recreation 2023 program guide. If nobody got this, please reach out to myself or Mr. Patterson, and anybody in the audience or other people, residents with need information. So I'll call it Barberton Parks, and I will give this to you through email, or you can stop down and get one. And any other miscellaneous discussion?
I have two things.
Yes, go ahead.
First of all, I wanted to know when Alejandro is going to be here. Do you know? You seem to be handling that.
I wasn't
No.
handling it. Mrs. Price.
Nope, they told me that you were gonna be handling it, he has not reached out to
Yeah.
me, and I emailed and left voice messages, so
Yeah.
when he's ready, we're ready.
Oh, yeah.
But I'm gonna need at least a 2-week notice
Okay.
for when he can appear, so that I can get him on the agendas.
Okay. I haven't talked to him like 3 weeks since last time I talked to you about it, but I'll try to send him another email or give him a call. Yeah, I'm thinking he's pretty busy right now with the new business and new occupation.
I don't know, I just never got an answer back, so
No worries. Your second question, ma'am?
The second question was the appropriation for the Parks Department in regard to the equipment. Do we know anything more about that yet?
Mrs. Miller is in here, or Mr. Flaker can answer that question.
The money has been appropriated, but that's all.
That's all? And it has been appropriated?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? Mrs. Angeloff?
I just want to thank Mr. Patterson and his staff for putting that out. I was walking this weekend and a lot of comments on that. They really like that. So to you and your staff, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. No, we plan on doing it yearly. Maybe want to see if the rest of the departments want to get involved the next time. Maybe do it 2 times a year, maybe it's spring, summer, winter, fall, winter.
it's just, something different that you have that in your hand that you can read without having to go on Facebook, on the website, something like that. So you actually have that, you can hang it up, in the refrigerator or have it handy, and it just says something about, so I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Mr. Greer?
Thanks, Chair. I just wanted to mention if he can't make it in to get I know he's busy, we'll accommodate and we'll mail it to him or drop it off.
Appreciate it. I'll let him know. I'll send him a call or an email again.
Thank you.
Mr. Haddock?
Thank you, Chair. Director Patterson, in this book here, the Saturday, November 25th, Christmas Swan Dive. Are we jumping in the lake?
Actually, yes.
Oh, my.
Kind of like a polar plunge, so. We actually wanted to do it earlier this year, but we got it, when we talked with the fire, we wanted to do everything right, so yes, it would be a dive in the lake.
Yeah, I know.
And I assume you'll be,
Whoever.
I assume you'll be the first in, right?
Maybe.
That's all I have, sir.
Any other questions? All right, hearing none, a motion to adjourn, please.
I'll make that motion.
And I'll second it.
Mr. Heidick and Mrs. Fry, we are adjourned at 6:06. With that, we pass, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Public welfare and safety. Mrs. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. The time is 6:07 PM, Monday, April the 10th. We are in council chambers, and I am bringing the Public Welfare and Safety Committee meeting to order. All members of the committee are present, which is myself as chair, Mr. Griffin, and Mrs. Coburn. All other council members are also present, as well as guests, as noted on my sheet. We have a couple of requests for legislation, the first being a letter from Robert A. Inkervati, Court Administrator, requesting legislation to permit the City of Barberton to enter into contract with Oriana House Incorporated to continue providing services, programs, confinement alternatives, and rehabilitation services for adult male and female offenders appearing before the Barberton Municipal Court. Emergency wording has been requested. Did everyone get a copy? Okay. Any questions about the contract, or no? All right. Do I have a motion to call for this?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you, Mrs. Coburn. Motion made by Joyce Coburn. Do I have a second?
Second.
And a second by Mr. Griffin. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. The second request is a letter from Lisa Akolish-Miller, Law Director, requesting legislation to enter into a one-year agreement with the Legal Defender's Office of Summit County. Emergency wording has been requested. Did everyone get a copy of this? All right. Any questions about this piece of legislation? Okay, hearing none, do I have a motion to call for this?
So moved.
Motion made by Mr. Griffin.
I'll second.
Seconded by Mrs. Coburn. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Okay. The next piece of legislation that was requested was a letter from Stephen M. Iona, Chief of Barberton Fire Department, requesting legislation to enter into contract with SNC Construction Company, LLC, for improvements to the Barberton Fire Station 1. Emergency wording is requested on this piece of legislation as well. Are there any questions on this? Did everyone receive a copy? No questions? Okay, Mrs. Angela?
If I can address it from Captain or Chief Iona, how long will this process take? The ADA, all the locker rooms and this remodel, do you know how long?
About 4 to 6 weeks is what they anticipate, without running into any problems with the plumbing room there.
Oh, okay, very good, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? No.
I'll
Okay,
make a motion, we call for this.
thank you. Motion made by Mrs. Coburn, seconded by
Second.
Mr. Griffin. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Okay, we have a few pieces of pending legislation which we will be voting on this evening, and that, the first is a piece of legislation that is presented by myself and Mr. Heidick, and it is to authorize payment to Oriana House Incorporated, an ordinance authorizing the Director of Finance to pay an invoice to Oriana House in the amount of $4,300 and declaring an emergency, and we had received copies of the invoice, and this was discussed in previous meetings. Are there any questions about this? No? Okay. Now I'm going to open up for miscellaneous discussion. Does anyone have anything for public welfare and safety that they would like to discuss? Mr. Jaber?
Thank you, Ms. Fry. Can you give us some updates on the new cruisers and also the flock cameras? I've been hearing a lot of constituents ask us about those two topics over the weekend.
I don't have any updates on either. I just heard that they were thinking about the flock cameras. And as far as the cruisers, all I know is that one of them's a Charger. Mrs. Eisman would probably be able to give you more information on that.
So, the police department received two of the donated cruisers. So those came in. And then, in terms of the flock cameras, I did try to call Mr. Greer last week. I didn't get a call back on that to give him some more information. But I have good news to report that this weekend, using our flock cameras, the police department was able to locate a missing man that had been an elderly man who had been missing since the night prior. They were able to find him the next day using our cameras. So that is the intent of the flock cameras, to help the police aiding in missing persons, assist with felony warrants, and it's a great tool to have to be able to solve crimes. Yes.
How many you have in the city right now?
I don't know how many, if they're not all installed yet, but there will be 17.
17 total? And the locations, will that be made out public, or?
I gave them to Mr. Heidick.
Okay. Can you also send us those emails too?
I can send that to you,
I
yes.
appreciate it, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
No, thank you, Mrs. Eisman. All right, are there any other questions or comments? Hearing none, do I have a motion to? Motion made by Mr. Griffin
I'll second.
and seconded by Mrs. Coburn. And we are adjourned at 6:14 p.m.
Thank you, Ms. Fry. Next up is Rules Marketing and Development with Mr. Griffin.
Thank you, Mr. President. Rules Marketing Development. The time is 6:13. We're meeting in council chambers. All members are present. And all guests is noted. Tonight we have no requests for legislation, and we don't have any pending legislation. Do I have any discussion for rules from the body or from the council members? No. Hearing none, do I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you, Mrs. Taylor.
I will second that.
Thank you, Mr. Heidick. And we're adjourned at 6:14. That's our pass. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Griffin. Next up is City Utilities with Mrs. Coburn.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to call the city utilities to order. It is 6:14. We're in the council chambers. All members are present and others as noted. We have a request from legislation, a letter from Dennis Weaver, interim utilities director, requesting legislation authorizing the mayor or his designee to execute a grant agreement with the Ohio Department of Public Safety, Ohio Emergency Management Agency, and the City of Barberton, effective 3/16/2023, in the amount of $975,000 for Phase 1 of Barberton Wolf Creek Dam Upgrade Project. Emergency wording is requested. Did everyone receive the letter for this? This is the Phase 1 of us starting on our dam. Are there any questions? Do I have a motion to call for this?
I'll make a motion.
And I'll second it.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
We have a letter from Dennis Weaver, Interim Utilities Director, requesting legislation to appropriate $105,500 from the unappropriated item of the Water Improvement Reserve Fund to the capital budget of the Water Improvement Fund. Emergency wording is requested, and we'll be referring this to finance. Everyone got that letter?
Mm-hmm.
Are there any questions? Do I have a motion to call for it?
I'll make a motion to call for it.
I'll second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
We have another letter from Dennis Weaver, Interim Utilities Director, requesting legislation authorizing the mayor to enter into a professional engineering service contract with Burgess and Nyepel for the Wolf Creek Dam Upgrade Project, Phase 1, for design, bidding, and construction services. The amount is not to exceed $944,000. This project is a grant funded at 90% under the FEMA Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, HMGP. Emergency wording is requested. Are there any questions on this one? Do I have a motion? Oh, Mrs. Angela.
I don't have any questions, but Mr. Weaver's been here a long time. How many times have you applied for this grant for this dam?
Well, we've applied for this specific one twice. We turned down the first time, we went right back. We received grants prior to that for planning. We used those to put together all the documents, the necessary engineering documents to apply for this. Then we kept working at it, and we've been successful. And by the way, this will roll right into phase 2. This is about a $9.5 million project. It's all going to be funded at 90%.
Great.
That's awesome.
Instead of causing us to have a significant rate increase, we're going to be able to cover almost this entire project with grants. So I'm really pleased that this is able to come.
Well, but I know on council, we always, was looking at grant money and then it was turned down and whatnot. And again, I'm going to tell you, I worked with you for many, many years, and it takes that knowledge to know how to go after these grants and keep going after these grants. And we really appreciate your staff and that working on this. This is a huge, huge project, and it's great. I tip my hat to you and your office. Thank you.
Thank you. And actually, I don't do anything in a vacuum. I'm doing this all with the support and the assistance, of the mayor's office as well. And without that, I really can't do anything.
A $9 million project is huge. And 90% in grants, that's even better. So,
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do I have a motion to call for it? Mrs. Fry.
I'll make a motion.
All in favor?
Aye.
We have no pending legislation at this time. Do we have any miscellaneous discussion for utilities? Hearing none, do I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
I'll second that.
We are adjourned at 6:20.
Thank you, Mrs. Coburn. Last but not least, Finance and Personnel, Mr. Heddick.
Thank you, Mr. President. Finance Personnel, it is 6:19, Monday, April 10th, 2023, in council chambers. The committee is present, which consists of Councilors Coburn, Thompson, President Greer, myself as chair. All others are noted. There is no request legislation. We reserve that for the Committee of the Whole nights. Pending legislation, we have Ordinance 46, 2023. Ordinance appropriating $80,000 from the unappropriated item of the Water Fund to the capital budget of the Water Fund, declaring an emergency. Any comments? Moving on, Ordinance 48, 2023. authorizing the Director of Finance to pay an invoice to Oriana House, Inc. in the amount of $4,300 and declaring an emergency. Any comments there? Right. That it's it for our pending, so Director Flaker, do you care to share the financial report with us?
All right, starting with the health care fund. The revenues for the month were $369,000. Expenses was $660,000. It was just high that month due to the timing of when we cut the check for the healthcare payment to Summit County. It didn't get out by the end of February. It went out at the beginning of March. So you just have 2 healthcare payments to Summit County that month, or in the month of March, which is making it that. Our unexpended fund balance is $1.8 million. Moving on to the income tax fund, you'll see our estimate for the March of 2023 was $926,000, almost $927,000. Actuals came in at $914,000, so we were about $13,000 under our estimate. For the year, we're over by $677,000. We did finish off the transfer to the street operating fund, and so from here on out, it's just transfers to the general fund, which we have $8.2 million left to transfer this year to the general fund to complete that. Moving on to the next page, the statement of cash receipts and disbursements. A couple things in the negative. It's the usual ones, the FEMA fund. Once again, that's the flood mitigation grants through FEMA. The CDBG fund, which is the HUD grant through the federal government. And then the next fund in the negative is the health insurance fund, Fund 660. That's only in the negative due to the encumbrances outstanding. We took out the PO for the whole year for the healthcare to Summit County. So just like in years past, when we make those payments every month, we'll do the charge back to the departments. So that negative balance will go away here in a handful of months. Moving on, that is just a statement of cash receipts for year to date. So the ending balances are all the same as the previous page. That's just showing you what the cash balance was at the first of the year and all the year's revenues and expenses. So moving on to that next section is the last 3 months of activity. You'll notice that the general fund unencumbered cash balance decreased, and that is only due to the encumbrances outstanding. You'll notice from last month, the encumbrances outstanding was a little over 1 million. This month, it's almost 2.5 million. So that increase is basically the decrease that we're seeing in the unencumbered cash balance. Special revenue funds increased slightly by about 500,000. Enterprise funds went up slightly by about 500,000. All other funds, you'll notice the unencumbered cash balance went down dramatically. Once again, that is due to the encumbrance being taken out for the healthcare to Summit County. So as the year goes on, that will get out of the negative balance and start reflecting more of what January and February kind of looks like come year end. So moving on to the year-to-date comparison, so March of 22 to March of 23, you'll notice the unencumbered cash balance for the general fund is up by about 5.8 million. A lot of that is due to us doing the reclassifying police and fire wages as lost revenue through the ARPA funds. Special revenue funds has stayed about the same. Enterprise funds is about the same, and all other funds you'll notice is up a little bit. So I mean, that just has to deal with the healthcare fund doing well last year, reflecting that about $200,000 increase from last year at the same time. So, any questions?
Thank you.
Thank you, Director. Do I have a motion to call for the approval?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you.
I'll second.
Thank you. Those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Is there any discussion from the committee?
I have none.
Mr. President?
Thank you, Chair. Random question. It's about the dam. Two questions. Are we still carrying secondary insurance for the dam? And if so, will the dam project alleviate that, and will we be able to carry like primary insurance?
Dr. Flaker?
So the update from the insurance company on the dam, we actually lost the secondary coverage on that. Can't remember if it was last year or the year before. We lost the secondary coverage because Travelers just wasn't willing to take the risk any further. My talks with the insurance company, we're probably gonna have to almost have that dam completely done before Travelers will take. Maybe they'll pick it up on secondary, once we start showing more improvement on it, like actually maybe start the construction. I can't speak on behalf of Wickard or Travelers, but hopefully we can get the secondary coverage on, and then hopefully once the project's complete, they're willing to put it back on the policy itself again, so without having to have that secondary coverage.
Thank you. I do have a follow-up question. How much additional was that coverage? It was quite a bit for the dam.
Yeah, I would have to go back and take a look.
Okay, I was just curious.
At the insurance packets, I can't remember off the top of my head.
Thank you. That was it, Chair. Thanks.
Thank you. Anything from the body? From the gallery? Seeing none, do I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you.
I'll second.
Thank you. And we are adjourned at 6:26.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Heidick. That concludes our individual committee meetings for this evening. We'll take a 5-minute break and begin the regular legislative meeting. Maybe we'll get some new chairs. Oh, you like that one?
No.
All I need is a spray on my glass thing.
It's, yeah. I gotta sit like. Huh? I don't think mine does.
Oh, it's a second reading then.
Thank you guys for bearing with that. Trying to figure that one out. Are we live?
We are live.
All right, welcome. Today is Monday, April 10th, 2023. This is a regular legislative meeting for Barberton City Council. I call this meeting to order at 6:41 PM. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, followed by invocation by Mrs. Fry. I pledge
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Heavenly Father, as this Barberton City Council meeting begins, bless us with your wise and caring spirit. Guide our council members and participating citizens to use this time to enhance the life in and of our city. Help us to conduct all deliberations with mutual respect, even in the face of disagreement. Keep us mindful that cooperation produces accomplishment. Watch over our military, police, and first responders. Help every level of government find solutions to the problems that are a part of today's complex society. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Mrs. Fry. All right. Clerk, please call the roll.
President Greer.
Here.
Mr. Heidick.
Here.
Mrs. Thompson.
Here.
Mrs. Bailey.
Here.
Mrs. Angela.
Here.
Mr. Griffin.
Here.
Mr. Jaber.
Here.
Mrs. Coburn.
Here.
Mrs. Fry.
Here.
Approval of the regular legislative meeting held, or approval of the minutes of the regular legislative meeting held on Monday, March 27th, 2023, as presented. Mrs. Fry. Mr. Heidick was absent. He can't motion.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. I move for the approval of the minutes of the regular legislative meeting held on Monday, March 27th, 2023.
Thank you. Mrs. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Fry's motion to approve the minutes.
Thank you. It was moved by Mrs. Fry and seconded by Mrs. Thompson to approve the minutes of the regular legislative meeting held on Monday, March 27th, 2023, as presented. Are there any remarks? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The minutes are adopted. Petitions and claims.
We have none.
Matters requested.
They've all been dispersed.
Thank you. Citizens addressing council. I forgot to check. Did you want to address council at all? You don't have to. I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
One quick thing, is that okay?
No? Well, we required, you can talk to the council. Yeah. You can talk to council members afterwards. We'll come up to you if that's all right. Thank you. First reading of ordinances and resolutions.
Ordinance number 46-2023, presented by Mr. Heidick, titled Appropriation Water Fund. An ordinance appropriating $80,000 from the unappropriated item of the water fund to the capital budget of the water fund and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mr. Heidick's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Heidick.
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn.
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson.
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey.
Yes.
Mr. Griffin.
Yes.
Mr. Jaber.
Yes.
Mrs. Fry.
Yes.
Mrs. Angela.
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt. Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to adopt ordinance 46, 2023.
Thank you. And Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second that motion on adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to adopt ordinance number 46-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Resolution number 47-2023, presented by Mrs. Coburn. Title: Memorandum of Agreement, Summit Soil and Water Conservation District. A resolution authorizing the mayor or his designee to execute a memorandum of agreement, MOA, with the Summit Soil and Water Conservation District, SWCD, for watershed services to provide conservation, technical and educational assistance, inspections of streams, channels, and riparian areas, development and implementation of protocols to manage stream maintenance, create and amend the non-point source implementation strategy, NPIS-IS plan, and collection of technical data that corresponds to the city's watershed goals and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Mrs. Coburn.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mrs. Fry?
Thank you, Mr. President. I second Mrs. Coburn's motion to suspend.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Coburn and seconded by Mrs. Fry to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Coburn.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to adopt the resolution number 47-2023.
Thank you. And Mrs. Fry?
Thank you, Mr. President. I second Mrs. Coburn's motion to adopt resolution number 47, 2023.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Coburn and seconded by Mrs. Fry to adopt resolution number 47-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 48-2023, presented by Mrs. Fry and Mr. Heidick. Title: Authorized Payment, Oriana House Incorporated. An ordinance authorizing the Director of Finance to pay an invoice to Oriana House Incorporated in the amount of $4,300 and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Hold on here. And Mr. Heidick?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. President. I second the motion for suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Fry and seconded by Mr. Heidick to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 48-2023.
Thank you. And Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second the motion to adopt.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Fry and seconded by Mr. Heidick to adopt ordinance number 48-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 49-2023, presented by Mrs. Angela. Title: Enter into contract Ohio Cat. An ordinance authorizing the mayor or his designee to enter into contract with Ohio Cat in the amount of $24,000 for the purchase of a new Cat PC 306 24-inch cold planer grinder.
Thank you. Is that an emergency?
It didn't have emergency order.
Okay.
Well, I
Motion.
think I asked for that, though, in my minutes.
I don't have
I
mine.
don't have it with me, I'm sure.
Okay, I'll check.
Well, if we pass with an emergency, they can forego the 30 days if you want to reread it.
Okay. Put the emergency wording in your saying.
Mrs. Angeloff?
Yes, because I believe I did ask for emergency wording.
Thank you.
I even called the office and asked for that.
Thank you. Yep, we'll just reread it with emergency wording.
Guess you have to amend it.
It wasn't, it was asked for, right?
Yes, in the
And
committee, yeah.
called out as an emergency.
Okay.
It's just not on the paperwork, that's all. So,
Okay. Ordinance number 49-2023, presented by Mrs. Angela. Title, enter into contract Ohio Cat. An ordinance authorizing the mayor or his designee to enter into contract with Ohio Cat in the amount of $24,000 for the purchase of a new Cat PC 306 24-inch cold planer grinder and declaring an emergency.
thank you. Motion to suspend. Mrs. Angeloff?
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rules required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. And Mrs. Bailey?
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Mrs. Angeloff's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Angeloff and seconded by Mrs. Bailey to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt. Mrs. Angela?
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance 49-2023.
Thank you. Mrs. Bailey?
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Mrs. Angeloff's motion on adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Angeloff and seconded by Mrs. Bailey to adopt ordinance number 49-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Angeloff?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Resolution number 50-2023, presented by Mrs. Angela. Title, Resolution ODOT Safe Route to School Grant 2023. A resolution of the Council of the City of Barberton authorizing the mayor to enter into contract with the Ohio Department of Transportation, ODOT, for Safe Route to School, SRTS, infrastructure project funding and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend. Mrs. Angela?
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rules as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mrs. Bailey?
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Mrs. Angeloff's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was required, a motion was made by Mrs. Angeloff and seconded by Mrs. Bailey to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Angeloff?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt. Mrs. Angeloff?
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of resolution number 50-2023.
Thank you. And Mrs. Bailey?
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Mrs. Angeloff's motion on adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Angeloff and seconded by Mrs. Bailey to adopt resolution number 50-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Angeloff?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Okay.
Yes.
Scared me. Sorry.
Motion for adoption carries. It's okay.
Ordinance number 51-2023, presented by Mrs. Coburn and Mrs. Angela. Title, 2023 Bids and Contracts, Years Requirements for Materials and Services, an ordinance authorizing the Director of Public Service or the Director of Public Safety to advertise for bids and/or enter into contracts in 2023 covering the year's requirements for materials and services used in the ordinary and daily operation of the municipal departments of the city of Barberton and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend, Mrs. Coburn.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the requirements,
The rule
I know.
as required.
I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mrs. Angela?
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second the motion for suspension.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Coburn and seconded by Mrs. Angeloff to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Coburn.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 51-2023.
Thank you. Mrs. Angeloff?
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second that motion for adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Coburn and seconded by Mrs. Angeloff to adopt ordinance number 51-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 52-2023, presented by Mrs. Coburn. Title, enter into contract MTech Company. An ordinance authorizing the mayor or his designee to enter into contract with MTech Company in the amount of $554,905 for the purchase of a new Gap Vax combination jet vacuum machine and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend, Mrs. Coburn.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mrs. Fry?
Thank you, Mr. President. I second Mrs. Coburn's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Coburn and seconded by Mrs. Fry to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Coburn.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 52-2023.
Thank you. Mrs. Fry?
Thank you, Mr. President. I second Mrs. Coburn's motion to adopt.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Coburn and seconded by Mrs. Fry to adopt ordinance number 52-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 53-2023, presented by Mrs. Angela. Title, enter into contract Hisson Kenworth. An ordinance authorizing the city of Barberton to enter into contract with Hisson Kenworth of Richfield, Kenworth, in the amount of $192,799 for the purchase of a new 2024 Kenworth T480 snow and ice truck, and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend, Mrs. Angela.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mrs. Bailey?
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Mrs. Angeloff's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Angeloff and seconded by Mrs. Bailey to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Angeloff.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 53-2023.
Thank you. Mrs. Bailey?
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Mrs. Angeloff's motion on adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Angeloff and seconded by Mrs. Bailey to adopt ordinance number 53-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 54-2023, presented by Mrs. Angela. Title, enter into contract, Ohio Cat. An ordinance authorizing the mayor or his designee to enter into contract with Ohio Cat in the amount of $207,632 plus a 10% contingency, $2,076.32, for a total of not to exceed $209,708.32 through the Ohio Revised Code Purchasing Program from Sourcewell, who is a cooperative purchasing consortium for the purchase of a new 2023 model 926M wheel loader and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend, Mrs. Angeloff.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mrs. Bailey?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Angeloff's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Angeloff and seconded by Mrs. Bailey to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Angeloff.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 54-2023.
Thank you. And Mrs. Bailey?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Angeloff's motion on adoption.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Angeloff and seconded by Mrs. Bailey to adopt ordinance number 54-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 55-2023, presented by Mrs. Bailey. Title, enter into contract with RIP Medical Debt. An ordinance authorizing the mayor to enter into contract with RIP Medical Debt in the amount not to exceed $110,000 and declaring an emergency. This is the first reading. This ends the first reading.
Second reading of ordinances and resolutions.
Ordinance number 39-2023, presented by Mrs. Thompson. Title, Project Impact Rule. An ordinance amending ordinance number 155-2016, sale of land bank properties to reflect updates to the Project Impact Program and declaring an emergency. This is the second reading. The first reading was on Monday, March 27th, 2023.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mrs. Angela?
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the suspension of ordinance 39-2023.
Second.
I don't know what I said. I second.
Second.
Second
Okay.
motion.
Thank you, Mrs. Angela. A motion was made by Mrs. Thompson and seconded by Mrs. Angeloff to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? I would just like to make a remark that this is going back to the Planning Commission, but they would like it off of council's books before it does. So that's why we are not going 3 readings and we're going to do what we do today. Are there any other remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Thank you. Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt. Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to adopt ordinance number 39-2023.
Thank you. And Mrs. Angeloff?
I'd like to second the motion for adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Thompson and second by Mrs. Angeloff to adopt ordinance number 39-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Angela?
No.
Mrs. Fry?
No.
Mr. Jaber?
No.
Mr. Griffin?
No.
Mrs. Bailey?
No.
Mrs. Thompson?
No.
Mrs. Coburn?
No.
Mr. Hyden?
No.
Motion for adoption fails.
This ends the second reading.
Third reading of ordinances and resolutions.
We have none.
Thank you. Miscellaneous and unfinished business. There's none. Appointments. We do have an appointment on the agenda, however, it won't be read today. All right. Is there anything else from the body? Sorry, Mr. Jaber?
Thank you, Mr. Greer. I had a couple constituents reach out to me about scheduling and organizing our vacations for council. They were very dissatisfied how we schedule our vacations and our little getaways, weekend getaways, and also missed our Monday council meetings. So one guy said, please schedule your vacation around council since you're elected to be here, not to be elected to go on vacation. His name was Jack. That's one of the constituents, and I told him I'd read what he wanted me to read for him. So, again, he just wants to let us know that if you want to do schedule a vacation, try to schedule around your, around council, since we are elected officials. That'll be it. Thank you.
All right, noted. Mrs. Angela?
It's not in our council rules.
Correct. Is there anything else from the body? Mrs. Fry?
I have been reading about the electric bills, that they're going to double in the month of June. And I just wanted to make everybody aware that our aggregation does go until 2025, May of 2025. And beginning in May, our new rate is 6.05. But if someone's not in the aggregation, their rate will be like 10.76. And if they're in the aggregation and want to opt out, they can go to www.energyharbor.com. And if they want to get into our aggregation, I have the phone number for that. It is 1-888-254-6359.
Sorry, can you repeat that number?
Which,
phone number?
1-888-254-6359.
Thank you.
And I also wanted to remind everyone that we got the auditor questionnaire to be filled out to return it. And that's all.
All right. Mrs. Angela?
I have a question for Mrs. Fry. Can you now at this point go into the city's
Aggregation.
You still can?
I think you
didn't know
can.
they
I
had
think
a
you can at
certain-
any time,
At
as
any
long as
time?
it's going, yes.
Okay, very
Mhm.
good.
Well, Mrs. Fry, don't we automatically be putting that if we don't make a choice by being a Barberton
Yes,
resident?
you have to opt out.
You have to opt out.
Yeah, but
That's what I thought.
some people do, and I just wanted to make note of that in case you get any calls about electric bills being really high.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've had a couple people ask.
I did too.
And seen a couple people asking about it, so I appreciate the information. Is there anything else from the body? All right, I don't have anything. Communication from the mayor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, council, for approving the purchase of the planer, the dump truck, Safe Route to School grant, and other pieces of legislation. These are really important as we address our streets, plan for the future, and provide the necessary equipment for our staff. The equipment that was approved tonight is just shy of $1 million total, but that's going to benefit our community for years to come, so thank you very much. At the last Change for Change event, we received donations of just over $900 for Barberton Sparkles. So we extended the time period through last Friday to see if we could, get past $1,000 because we were getting close. Very excited to announce that we've collected over $1,400 total. So thank you to everybody who reached out. Councilman Greer, Councilwoman Taylor Thompson, Councilwoman Coburn, Aspire, and everyone else who donated. So they're going to be able to put that money to good use. So thank you very much. Also very exciting, since we started Change for Change and Jeans Days and other donation different events, we've brought in over $80,000 since 2012. That helps Barberton nonprofits, stays in Barberton, 100% of it, helping Barberton residents and Barberton kids. And that take into account that we took off almost a full year and a half due to COVID. So that's a ton of money that's been raised by Barberton people for Barberton people. So thank you. Also good news, we were recently named one of the 30 best small towns to retire in America. That was through GoBankingRates.com. They put that out there the other week, and quite a lot of amenities that they mentioned with the city of Barberton, and I think we're number 16 in the top 30 throughout the U.S. So, new business last week, Pedal Stomper. We welcomed them into the White Rabbit Galleries. So they do a podcast, and we'll be having different features throughout the year. So welcome to the city of Barberton. Last week, Jen was here to talk about the speeding in town, so I met with her this morning, or actually this afternoon, speeding on West Hopkinton, and we've been talking about this for a while. Prior to her coming to council, she had been emailing, as she mentioned, Lieutenant White, myself, and others, and we have been working on several things. So meeting went great, and it's just not West Hopkinton. You know, it's getting nice outside. People are getting their cars out there, their motorcycles. Had complaints of mopeds and things across the board. So we're working on that. Want to make sure that everybody is safe, but we've got to make sure that we're making the right decisions when it comes to safety of our streets, you know, other motorists, pedestrians, bikers, bicyclists, everybody. So, but we did meet today. As mentioned earlier, want to thank everyone involved as council discussed the first phase of the work on the dam at the reservoir. Been very successful in receiving these grants, and you know, they turned us down the first time. We got back on that bicycle and applied again. So, you know, over $9 million for phase one going into phase two. And what's important about these grants is that it saves taxpayers dollars, right? It's money that we receive from the government, and that we don't have to increase fees or anything like that. So whether it's the dam or it's streets or park equipment or whatever it is, it's saving tax dollars in the community here by getting these grants. So, and again, none of these projects or grants, you know, happen in a vacuum. So there's a huge team that works tirelessly to make sure that we're applying for the right grants, that we meet the requirements, and if, you know, we fall short because there's a lot of submissions or whatever the criteria is, you know, we jump back on that and apply again. So again, saving taxpayer money. And lastly, just still handing out free disinfectant and signing people up for the Barberton Services Relief Program. Again, giving residents a break on their utility bill if they meet the criteria, and helping to save taxpayer money. So that's all I have, unless there's any questions. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Last week, I was on the phone with Director Eisman there. In Norton, they have these boxes they've been mounting to poles that just flash you're speeding there. And I know when those folks came and spoke last week, they said that when the speed wagon was there, people slowed down, but then when it was gone, they just sped up again. Are those boxes any sort of option?
Yeah, so we've been researching those. They're solar. What we've been looking at, what Norton has, is the solar-powered speed limit signs. So you can set the limit, and then if it goes over, it'll flash. Want to make sure that we're getting the best equipment, and it's used in high traffic areas to help, you know, let the motorists know when they're over the speed limit. It's funny when I talk to residents and they have a complaint about speed, and they'll bring those up. Because it's obviously very bright, it's kind of low maintenance with the solar power, but they don't want it in front of their house because at night, you know, the light could come in the window. So we want to make sure that it's in a location that is going to be useful, right? But also is less intrusive to the residents. So in this situation with West Hopkinton, the speed area is kind of right there at 8th Street all the way up to 14th Street. So kind of gives a good area where it's business and not a lot of homes where we could put those. In other areas where it's a little more residential, think of Summit Street, it's a little more difficult, but there's ways to kind of shield that as well. So, but yes, that's definitely an option. So we've been looking at that.
Thank you.
Yep. Anything else? All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayor. Nothing else, do I have a motion to adjourn?
Make that motion to adjourn.
Thank you. Is there a second? Council?
I'll second Mr. Heidick's motion.
All right. Moved by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mr. Thompson that we adjourn. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed?